Today we have as our keynote speaker, Mr. James Ehrlich, who's the founder of ReGen Villages, and he's also entrepreneur in residence at the Stanford University. So, Mr. Ehrlich, over to you to make your presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity. Okay, so I really appreciate this opportunity, like I said, to present this not only vision, but also plans for the future of living in resilient, regenerative neighborhoods where we're focusing essentially on critical life support systems of clean water, renewable energy, high yield organic, biodynamic, localized food production, and waste to resource management, all in a combination of creating the symbiosis related very much to nature. So what I'd like to do is just sort of give you a little more background about myself. I am founder of ReGen Villages, which is a Dutch holding company, but with offices in Sweden, UK, here in the US, and most recently in British Columbia in Canada. I'm currently based at Stanford University, where I continue my affiliation as an entrepreneur in residence in the Stanford School of Medicine, which is part of the Stanford Flourishing Project. And it's a wonderful cohort at Stanford on this idea of how do we create the circumstances for happy longevity, which of course is related to how we live and where we live and what we eat, etc. So I'm also a faculty member at Singularity University. I'm a senior fellow at NASA Ames Research Center, and under the Obama administration was appointed to White House State Department Joint Task Force on this topic of regenerative infrastructure. So my journey really began in an urban context. I grew up in New York, in New York City, so I understand, what it means to live in a big city. I moved out to Northern California because of my interest in technology and software, and was involved with a wonderful group of people living north of Silicon Valley, north of the Golden Gate Bridge, in this area that is known for these small plot, organic, biodynamic family farms. So I began this sort of dual journey in my entrepreneurial life. One was, of course, focusing on the software company that we were running. The other was this idea of doing case study research and learning about these small plot family farms. And I was really inspired by the work of Rudolf Steiner and Buckminster Fuller, this idea that came out of Australia in the 1970s called permaculture or permanent culture, which is this idea of creating these incredible flourishing and abundant food supplies in these seemingly chaotic, dense food forest scenarios, but that once you establish the relationship between these different cultivars and plants and trees and bushes, etc., that it becomes self-sustaining. They actually support each other and provide year-round delicious nutrition and menu items. I was drawn then to these communities because I love food. I love to eat. I love the flavors of the world. I love different recipes and stories. And as I was doing this case study research, this actually branched off into producing a very popular television cooking show here in the US that was called Organic Living. And at the apex of the show, we reached about 35 million homes a week, and had a best-selling companion, a cookbook that I co-authored on Hachette in 2007. But the stories were really more than about just the food. They were also about this symbiosis of where the food was going and into these neighborhoods, and where people, of course, were eating this delicious bioavailable nutrition, and the connectivity of both waste and food waste, animal waste, and human waste becoming useful as an asset and not as something that needs to be mitigated. So I was really curious and compelled about these ideas of flows of nature. So when I came to Stanford in 2012, my primary thesis was really on this idea of this question: can we create a software interface to nature? Can we understand what she is asking, what we can provide, what she's already doing? And so I was inspired by this work by Dr. Suzanne Simard from the University of British Columbia, who came up with this term, the Wood Wide Web versus the World Wide Web, when she had discovered this incredible fibrous network, this sort of Ethernet network under the forest floor, which is comprised of fungus. And these large organisms called mycorrhizal bundles, mycelial networks, which are incredible because they inoculate themselves into the root systems of the plants and the cultivars. And it is a symbiotic relationship across species. So it actually creates a framework, which is a long-term ledger that's a have-need network. It is a network of mineral, carbon, sugar, all kinds of nutrients, even water allotments. And this organisms can span upwards of 250 plus circular kilometers, being one bundle, mycorrhizal bundle. And what's compelling from this research really is that 30% of our DNA is actually fungal. It's the oldest living organism on Earth. Discovered was a mushroom. It's over 4 billion years old, and going all the way up, to a cosmological scale. Imagine this: that just 18 months ago, they discovered that galaxies are actually interconnected with each other across vast distances of space via dark matter, these thin fibers of electromagnetic dark matter. And when simulated, it looks a whole lot like a mycorrhizal bundle. Now, what's important to note about this is that there's no central brain to mycelia. It's actually one living organism that can be huge, but there's really intelligence at the point of sensing and the ability to act at the point of sensing. And that's where I really derived this concept of the village operating system, Village OS, that we could actually have a software stack that could understand for the first time ever the nutritional flows of food, water, energy, waste to resource management, connectivity to energy positive, passive house infrastructure, and of course external services. But the primary goal is to create these neighborhoods that can feed themselves, right? That the neighborhoods themselves are designed around this permaculture, around these berms and these guilds and these swells, these herbals and these medicinals, and all these different varieties of delicious menu items that have almost zero, or pretty much zero, kilometers between cultivation and people's plates. And we would argue that that's more bioavailable nutrition because it hasn't gotten onto an airplane or onto a truck, gone through warehouse distribution, packaging, sitting out under fluorescent light in a supermarket, that kind of thing. But also that we marry the soil-based farming at the neighborhood scale with some amount of controlled farming. So these would be aquaponic and aeroponic systems, are incredible ability for circularity. These are systems that are sort of ancient Asian technology, which is essentially using fish, freshwater shrimp, crawfish, several species of fish. Their waste is actually ammonia, but through a very light biological interaction, we can convert that from nitrites to nitrates. And with a low energy water pump, this nutrient-rich water essentially is the plant food and the fertilizer for the cultivars. And then that fills these bins, and with gravity, the water trickles down through all the different plant beds and then comes back to the fish tanks purified. And this farming technique has been able to save almost 75 or 80% water use, with almost 1/3 increased year-round, year-to-end yield in terms of biodiverse cultivation. So it's quite different than hydroponics and sort of controlled environment farming under strict LED lighting, which is sort of a clean room way of farming. I'm not really as keen on that as I am in aeroponics. You can also get the sort of idea that with the larger soil-based farming at the neighborhood scale, and then the controlled farming and what people can grow next to their doorsteps, that you start to get this picture of how these communities really work. So just very briefly, one of the other things that we've been focusing on is how to continuously feed the fish and feed the chickens and small animals by using food waste and animal waste through anaerobic digestion. And so first is a wonderful bioreactor, which is the aquatic worm. The aquatic worm is high on omega-3, fat, calcium. It's perfect fish food. Then there's the black soldier fly larvae, high in calcium and fat. Both of these little creatures eat their own weight every day in food and animal waste. Then they're the perfect fish food and chicken food, so we don't have to spend any money on buying pre-processed meal, which isn't good for those animals anyway, or us. But the best part is that this anaerobic digestion, the waste product, if you will, from the worms and the flies, is nutrient-rich, microbe-filled topsoil, which is gold. And that can then be spread out across these vast areas where you get, again, this web of life. And soil is so critically important for us to not be watching runoff with rainstorms. And that's why how we farm and how we create ground cover is critical to healthy soil and healthy environments. Also capturing as much water as possible. What you're looking at here is this metabolic integration, right? A neighborhood that's actually designed in a way where for the first time ever, the infrastructure can be knowledge of each other. So food, water, energy, circular waste to resource, housing, and learn from each other and improve from each other. And becomes this idea of the sentient neighborhood infrastructure connected to smart houses. I've been off to say that a smart house inside of a dumb neighborhood makes absolutely no sense. So we focus on at ReGen Villages this idea of the full stack sentient neighborhood using machine to both design and then operate these communities with, of course, access to other external services. So if you can imagine a software stack that can look at a piece of land, at a geospatial data of a land grant, and then just by essentially machine learning, start to create beautiful neighborhood infrastructure on that land that not only doesn't compromise the conservation and the open space of this area, but actually creates the circumstances for overproduction of these beautiful, healthy ingredients that can support the people not only who live in those neighborhoods, those new build neighborhoods or retrofit neighborhoods, but also can have a public goodwill radius, a spillover, if you will, of all of those good things: clean food, clean water, clean energy, waste into resource asset classes. So the same software, of course, that designs those neighborhoods, those communities, the village operating system then becomes the farmhouse server and can then operate and run those neighborhoods. So it's a really exciting use of technology to change the rules urgently around the world about how we can build these neighborhoods at scale in different parts of the world, in different climate zones, different socioeconomic access and means, but also that we are building them based on a way that the software can then communicate with each other across climate zones, learn from each other, and then autonomously improve or mitigate. So it's very much like, if you're familiar with Buckminster Fuller and his resource-driven maps of the world versus sort of arbitrary lines and kind of government maps and boundaries. Then also from a Tesla model, that you have this idea of these neighborhoods that can wake up in the morning with a software upgrade because they've learned some very important information from other communities around the world. This is how we view the use of machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotic actuation, and of course data, that it should be and has to be for the benefit of people and planet. And really what we're talking about here is these beautiful resilient communities, multicultural, multi-ethnic, different kind of socioeconomic level, but also where people can age in place. This idea of senior living or assisted living that's separate from the rest of our culture is wrong. It's anathema to "it takes a village," right? But that we can reimagine these open spaces for water capture and cisterning, and whether it's a flood zone or a drought zone, every drop of water really is precious. That we blend in this relationship of animal husbandry and cultivation with these varied protein and nutritional sources, depending, on whatever person's diet is, pretty much, that at the neighborhood scale, we can have the safety, really, of food production. And then you start to really get this idea of the software creating these master plans that are, primarily 2/3 at least or more focused on food and abundant surplus of delicious food and access and agency with that food. In addition, of course, to clean water and clean energy and these other kinds of services. We understand the future of mobility is going to be autonomous within the next decade or sooner, including drone deliveries and drone taxis. So I'll just go very quickly through this part of, sort of the built environment, which is focused in many ways on really primarily social affordable density, that we can use earthen building materials to create these kinds of social affordable apartments, tiny homes, very affordable kinds of condominiums and townhomes, semi-detached for seniors and those with disabilities, and even larger homes, but that can be shared in these micro mortgage relationships. So co-housing, co-living, which is also becoming incredibly popular around the world. We love this idea of earthen building materials. This is an example, in an area where we would be looking at mass timber, which is a wonderful circular building material. But using these prefab building techniques, these residential towers can go up very quickly, are incredibly breathable and natural environments to live in. But most importantly, they can be put together in an assembly line and built, very cost effectively. 1/3 less construction waste, 1/5 less construction time on site. We love this idea of 3D extrusion, 3D printed homes, where within 24 to 48 hours, you can actually have the basis of your house built, and then within a couple of weeks or less, have it move-in ready for less than $5,000 per house, finished. Especially using earthen building materials like hemp and hempcrete. And hemp is an amazing nutritional source as well. It's one of the, I think, most incredible plants, weeds on Earth, because it puts more nitrogen into the soil than it takes out. In terms of the building material, it has incredible tensile strength. It can make these very beautiful wall units and modules, very gorgeous looking homes that are seismic proof and pest resistant, flame retardant, and then the material can be composted 100 years later when you're done, with that particular building. We have looked very carefully about this idea of urban permaculture and urban food production. And so we can take components of what we're doing with ReGen Villages and bring that really to this kind of, let's say, a mid-rise urban infill. And a building like this could be made self-reliant if there's some adjacency with open space. We have outreach across the world since 2014. ReGen Villages has opportunities to really show a plan that can be replicated and scaled. That's really critical. We are very popular in the news, 150 plus million web impressions, 27,000 families now registered to be involved and live and buy and rent homes in our communities. Amazing technical partners. I won't go through them, but the bottom line is top of their class. Because I continue my affiliation at Stanford and Singularity University, we have these amazing collaborations with universities all around the world. And the goal really is this, is to create the circumstance to essentially transact with sovereign wealth, pension funds, and green transition funds. So we are part of the EU Smart Rural Village Commission, helping to shape the rules and the guidelines across the EU for what constitutes a smart rural community. Most recently, as you may have known or heard, we became part of this UN Climate Change Secretariat Resilience Lab, which we're looking forward to making some new announcements about that very shortly. And essentially, we're looking at really this idea of these very beautiful communities built around the world. And we have a great team. We're building our team, of course, as we go in different countries around the world. And ladies and gentlemen, ReGen Villages, the future of living in self-sustaining, edible, walkable, bikeable communities that can withstand the dynamically changing environmental, economic, and now, of course, health issues around the world. So I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, James, for that lovely presentation. A lot of information. So this is still being tried out, right? We haven't seen anything implemented on the ground yet, is it? Right.
At this moment, we are continuing to build out our village operating system software. We have been involved with various local governments in different countries, and Netherlands and Sweden and the UK, here in the US, Canada, other places in MENA and both North Africa, Middle East, and South Africa, looking at all the different climate zones, basically, in terms of enabling this data into our village operating system software. And currently we're raising the private equity sufficient for us to start to build our first pilot communities in some of these key locations. And then from there, our plan is to create, quite a large fund that would allow us to essentially be a software company with access to global finance.
Right. So a quick question to, not a question, actually, quick request to everyone who's joining us. Please type in your questions in the chat box. I will take them and read it out. So first question, 1 second.
Thank you, Paul.
So this is from Suramya. Paul says it's a great presentation. Yes. So we have a few from UNFCCC here as well. So the question from Suramya is, will this be sustainable in all climate conditions? Can we apply what you said in any location geographically?
Yeah, that's exactly our point, is developing this agnostic middle layer of software that can use machine learning to build itself further and grow itself further, specifically based on climates, local, regional, national, but then relate that to similar climate zone in other parts of the world. And that's something that's incredibly unique and hasn't been done before. And that's something that we are really happy to be providing. And again, it's really this idea that that these systems love all of the complexity, they love the variability, they love all of the data. And so, yeah, it's an exciting place for, we think, for machine learning and actuated robotics to play a role for the future of flourishing abundance for humanity. I'm looking now at the next question. Could the elements of ReGen Villages be integrated into existing megacities, especially those in developing countries? I grew up in New York City, as I mentioned, and it's a lovely, vibrant place. You can get anything you want delivered at 2:30, 3 in the morning, as long as you have money, of course. But I noticed from a very young age how brittle the infrastructure is and how dependent it is in a domino effect kind of way at a district scale. So if something goes wrong, it not only goes wrong, but it goes wrong typically for a lot of people at once. And if you have a number of anomalies occur simultaneously, then you can really have the basis of what NASA predicted about 8 years ago, which is global civilization collapse around the lack of access to these services because of these kinds of things happening. So our first goal really is sort of outside of cities to get back to the peri-urban and the rural and the countrysides. You've probably seen now that there's been an exodus globally from megacities, from cities, out into the countryside, wherever people can go, whether they have money or they don't have money. People have been fleeing out to the countryside. The issue is that the countryside has been abandoned for so many years, so many decades, that we need to build these places back up in the right way. And that's where we see the first part of our software really coming into play and our design thinking. Yes, we have, as I showed, for cities and megacities. And this would be essentially block by block retrofits. These would be sort of external services to existing infrastructure that would be initially food bearing, water capture, energy generation, and some amount of waste digestion. But it wouldn't be necessarily taking an existing building and converting that, because there's so much old infrastructure, the variability there would kind of fall in on itself. But it's a great question, and it's probably one of the #1 questions that we get. One more question: the idea of floating cities or seasteads been discussed for a while. So I've been an advisor to some of the seasteading folks. We've been talking to them. I think it's really important to understand a few things. #1, there really is no such thing as the high seas. There's no place on Earth, on any of the oceans, where you're not infringing somehow or another with some government, with some place that probably doesn't want you there, in terms of building a government-free city or place. So that's the first thing. The second is that floating cities without connectivity or adjacency to some landmass offer a lot of engineering complexity and also are really expensive. So there's actually a lot of landmass. As a species, we only occupy 2 or 3% of the available landmass. And what we have to be doing is restorative, regenerative, resilient practices that enable these places on land to become more attractive, where people can live and feed their families and take care of each other in such a way that it actually reduces burdens on government. And that's really what we're on about with our long-term positive externality spreadsheets. So is there a date of expiry in contrast to normal housing? Yeah, well, we're focusing on trying to look at earthen building materials that can last for 100+ years. And that when you're done with those materials, the idea of circularity is that they have a second and third life to them, or like with hempcrete, they can be composted and you can sort of start anew. So yeah, it's a great question, and we have to be thinking about living within nature and within planetary boundaries. And construction is one of the biggest polluters on the planet. There's just no doubt about it. So we're really looking at how we can innovate in this area. Another question, urban or semi-urban spaces has conventional thinking of land value and productivity. Yeah, well, you know, we have to rethink spreadsheets. That's the bottom line, right? You know, this idea of 25% iterated rate of return, IRR, with a 2-year exit from typical real estate deals is extractive, and it's predatory, and it just causes this tremendous, you know, inability for people to afford a home in a mortgage in their lifetime. So it just continues to inure this cycle of debt for decades to come. We have a different idea, which is that we can work with the best kinds of earth and building materials, the right kind of landowners, the right kind of governments, and create a new rule book where we create density for around social affordable housing, a mix of some market rate. Now, especially because COVID, that percentage of market rate will actually even be more reduced. So it's really more about systemic funding. But to create these neighborhoods as quickly as we possibly can. This is urgent. This is not like some kind of Silicon Valley, you know, pitch. This is actually an urgent call to action to build these neighborhoods at scale around the world through prefab, industrialized approach, but that creates, in effect, these communities that are self-sustaining over a period of time. So that's really the goal, is that we look at spreadsheets over 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, that these spreadsheets are really about patient debt finance. And moreover, it's about how we reduce burdens on healthcare systems, because people are living healthier, happier lives. My research, by the way, parallels what are called blue zones. Blue zones are these places around the world where people are living to 100, 110, never taking pharmaceuticals, not seeing doctor, not going to emergency rooms. What's going on there? Is it the diet? Is it the community? Is it the access and agency to their natural resources? And the answer is it's sort of a combination of those things. And actually, those things are pretty simple to enact and pretty simple to put forward to a massive population on Earth. And that's what we're really on about here. We want to focus on as many human beings and many families as possible living in regenerative resiliency. This isn't turnkey suburbs for for millionaires and upper middle class. This is the idea of creating beautiful places that are flourishing for for many people. And this next question I see is, what is the initial cost? It is in a Northern European, US, Canadian, developed economic context. The initial pilot communities will be, probably fairly expensive, maybe somewhere around 75, 80 million euro, 100 million, whatever US, to build 300 or 400 homes. And that, of course, makes an average home price somewhere between 150, 200,000 euro. But our goal really is, like I said, that as we create relationship with the right prefab manufacturers, whether that's a Tata or a Landmark Homes or Sidewalk Labs, whoever it may be, that's building this kind of prefab infrastructure, that, and also of course extruding, like companies like Icon, 3D printing houses. These kinds of homes can sell for, as I mentioned, $5,000 US, complete turnkey house. And not only that, they're using earth and building materials to 3D print, these homes. So they go up very quickly. They take about a day or two to cure. The finishings go in, and the family can move in probably less than 2 weeks. Of course, you have to first do the land clearing and infrastructure. So there could be, 3 or 4 months prior to that to get a neighborhood like that built. But what we're really trying to do with our software, number one, is change the rules. Change the rules for zoning and permitting on open space. Change the rules for community assessment, fast track, and permit pulling, fast track. Then this makes our software incredibly attractive for developers and constructors and government and communities to see a path forward, to have a neighborhood go from a master plan, software generated, to move in less than 12 months. That's like light speed. And I think it can actually happen sooner than that, maybe within 6 to 8 months, especially in developing economic areas. In other words, we can go to rural India, sub-Saharan Africa, ASEAN, and imagine several hundred home community going up in a few weeks and being move-in ready in a few months. And then over a short period of time, those communities start to blossom and fruit. And certainly over a course of 2, 5, 7, 10 years, those communities are overproducing. So they're asset classes, which means those populations don't have to migrate to do menial labor. They can stay there and take care of their families and watch their kids go to school. Or they can have connectivity through now the sort of broadband that's being promised through satellites and others to work from their village. And I think that's a terribly exciting idea of these new economic models being blossomed out of these kinds of communities. The key thing for us is we must urgently address critical housing shortages, access to clean water, access to clean food, renewable energy, and hygiene. If we can answer the Maslow of hierarchical needs for humanity using technology in a compassionate way, the business model will emerge from this that is long-term and patient, that is based on the benefits provided to these communities. So it's quite innovative in that way and on all those fronts. Sorry, it was a long answer, but it's important to talk about finance with these things.
Yes, thank you. And there's another question which is sent to me accidentally, I think privately. So I will read it out. Have the designs and material met all standardization processes and housing regulations in the EU and the US? This is to double check whether things are in order before we set it forward.
No, it's a great question, and really the idea of us, we're agnostic. First of all, let me just say that we're agnostic in terms of architecture, so long as that it is focusing on prefab, especially circular earthen building materials that are already proven and already sanctioned by the rule books, and cost effective. And then we're also agnostic in terms of working with these large prefab assembly line manufacturers of housing units and 3D printing of these kinds of housing units. So essentially, we aggregate the data of those systems, architecturally, material, all of the rules related in those particular local, regional, national government settings. And so it's already pre-baked in that what we're going to be offering and building in that area, in those communities, already it meets or exceeds the government standards for housing. So again, that's the only way we're going to be able to leapfrog, to change the rules, by working within the rules. So again, machine learning, imagine it just loves complexity. Now, if you were to have to start and understand, like just pick any country, what the rules are from a parliamentary level, from a regional government level, and a local level of building a neighborhood, I don't think a single human could understand all of the, the rules and certifications and guidelines and etc. But machine learning loves that. It loves this idea of very fixed rule books. And then our software essentially creates an onion skin, a layer over that existing rule book that says, well, if you do this, you do this, and you do this, you start to create these green check marks that relate to those existing rules, but show a new rule book of what these communities will be able to produce and provide and lower burdens. And that's the way we really envision how software can be brought to bear. So I mean, these are all amazing questions, and we are learning as we develop and learning as we grow. One of also the biggest pieces for us that we're working on right now, and I think is really interesting and really exciting, is oral traditions relating to land grants. Many places around the world, you have indigenous voices that have been involved in relationship naturally and with natural flows to these areas and adjacency to these areas. And of course, real estate development, for the most part, never thinks about that adjacency or those natural flows. They just kind of pave over some piece of land as if it never had any relationship to any nature before or any population before. So we're doing some interesting work right now with the island nation of Vanuatu, connected to this research group in Lebanon, and also to First Nations groups in British Columbia. And we think it's a very interesting piece to go with our village operating system software, is the story behind each land grant that also will allow us, we think, to accelerate community assessment when we consider and we understand and really appreciate those indigenous voices from those lands.
Yes, quick follow-up question. I'm sorry if I missed this in your presentation. Do you also have like a governance structure, like a proposed governance structure for these villages where things would be sustainable to avoid certain issues that might be predictable in terms of resource utilization and all?
Well, yeah, and of course it's all these many things are have variability based on location. So we would look. The idea really is to have the software look at the land grants and the areas and the adjacency, as I just mentioned, the natural resource flows that exist there, but also whether they're floodplains, in wadis, or whether they're they're prone to drought. Also, what if there are other kinds of pollutants or mitigants that we have to deal with. Some of these areas, of course, have been just denuded by terrible farming practices, just years and years, decades of poisonous kind of farming with herbicides and fungicides and pesticides, and all the runoff and all the things that that then create algae blooms and all these different things. We believe that some of those areas may first need to be focused on from a restorative capacity, that you go there and you spend the time and energy and effort to create first just the regenerative infrastructure, and that over a period of half a decade or a decade, that can be rejuvenated and restored and rescued, and then you create circumstances where you can create a built environment. But other places we can move faster and create these communities. The key thing really is where I am now in Silicon Valley. It's city. We've just lost in our area in points north 4.2 million to forest fires, and the fires are still burning. We have, in the middle of our country, rapid succession of hurricanes and floods. For the first time ever, the Midwest, the breadbasket of the U.S., experienced a hurricane in the middle of the country, a hurricane in the middle of the country. It's never been seen before. That did terrible crop devastation. And of course, what we've been focusing on is the fact that megacities and cities have been this lovely illusion in many ways to draw people out of the rural areas into what's been this idea of sustainability by proximity, right? But those places, as I mentioned, are brittle. And when they break badly. And then you're going to have, in any case, swaths of populations moving back out to the countryside. We must be prepared. We must create these lily pads of self-sustaining neighborhoods that can pop up like mushrooms, literally, from my talk. So I see a question here on hamlets in rural India. Some also happen to have sustainable houses, which is great. The idea there is to increase economic status of the community as a whole. Is there an option we can get access to data technologies, which mentioned, essentially we have been interested in this idea, and I know that the Indian government especially has taken a pretty bold approach to trying to focus on rural development and housing and sustainability. So our goal really is to take if we can, and our hope is to do this, a systemic approach to work with national government, with regional government, local government, but primarily to bring in the right industrial players who can bring forward, these solutions in a way that can build these neighborhoods very rapidly, because we need new build in addition to retrofit to these existing villages. And so the answer really is we do intend to create an open source access and to our APIs. So the answer is yes, we will have a good portion of our tech and our OS available for folks to be able to access, especially from these areas that need it the most in rural India and other parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa and ASEAN. So talk about disaster events and brittleness. Yeah, I mean, look, we need to build high where we know there's going to be floods, and also cistern that water. This idea of when a flood comes, that it runs off into the sea is really inane. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, you look at Chennai, for instance, you have a monsoon and then you have drought. And then, you have these terrible floods and no capacity really for truly cisterning that water. So we have to get better at how those communities get built. So absolutely. And where we know there's drought, creating again this opportunity for when rain does come, that we create the right kind of higher level capture for water that can then seep into these aquifers. Again, it's not a lot of rocket science here. It's really just a little bit of logical permaculture infrastructure, and a lot of it actually is pretty low tech, to be perfectly honest. So consider for those things, and then it prepares for those things, and yeah, I mean, we do the best we possibly can to mitigate against risk. Every day there's something new happening because climate change is accelerating. It's exponential. It's getting worse, and the circumstances are broadening from all those different perspectives. So if we get overrun by locusts, well, guess what? We capture as many of those locusts as we possibly can, because that's the next level up in terms of protein. They ate the crops, well, then you eat them. Otherwise, you're going to starve. So in other words, you have to look at what nature's flows are giving and what the response can be. And there's a lot of amazing work that's been done over the last 100 years, 150 years on this topic of regenerative permaculture, regenerative resiliency, organic biodynamic, small plot, family farming, community-based neighborhood farming, and production, which the UN and the UNCTAD report from 2012, its report could not be any clearer. It's like a 72-point font that said, time to wake up. The best way to feed 10 billion people is not big ag. It's not. It's small, hyperlocal production. So how can these neighborhoods effectively manage risks that are on a larger scale? Well, you know, in terms of scale, I believe neighborhood. I'm a neighborhood guy. You know what I mean? So whether you live in a neighborhood in Manhattan or a neighborhood in Mumbai, the idea really is, what can I do in my neighborhood that creates the circumstances for resiliency? And you go block by block, right? So in building a scalable ReGen Villages neighborhood or series of interconnected neighborhoods that could form a town, okay, I'm not a city person in that way, but a town, each one of those neighborhoods are self-sustaining in their regenerative infrastructure. Because when something breaks, if something breaks, you don't want the domino effect of things to go bad for a lot of people. You want it to be isolated for the system to understand what happened quickly and to do the workarounds quickly. So again, it's this idea of lily pads, of self-sustaining, beautiful communities that work in support of the people who live there, that the neighborhood infrastructure is nurturing, is there for you and your family and for generations to come. And that's the relationship we used to have before these megacities, okay? We've never been more disassociated from nature than we are right now because of this bill of goods that we were sold in terms of big cities. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-city. I love good urban, delicious food. I love the flavors and the culture. I love the diversity of populations. We just feel like there has to be a balance. And there's enough space on Earth where we can build these communities. You know, I spend time with colleagues from NASA because I'm part of this NASA Ames Research Fellowship. And there's a lot of folks who've given up on Earth. They're focused on Mars right now. They're focused on the moon to create habitats. I know that the Earth still has plenty of opportunities for us to get this right. We don't need the exit velocity and the harsh environments on other planets. And again, I'm not against space travel and exploration. I'm all in favor. But I really feel like we happen to live on a planet, and we need to understand that it's our mother, and we have to relate in a symbiotic way to support her, and then she'll support us. So that's what I'm off to say, that if we take a half a step towards Mother Earth, she will literally throw her arms around us and take care of us.
Okay, thank you, James. It was lovely speaking with you. I know you have something starting in 2 minutes, so I don't want to give heart attacks to them. I remember
my next call is in 15 minutes. So if there are any more questions, I'm happy to address and answer.
Okay. Yes,
Whatever.
I have one for you actually, because some of the places we work in Africa and Asia. So if you're going to do work in these countries, some of the material you mentioned might not be available. So do you have other alternates that can be used, which is specific for different areas? I think this is addressed, but like hemp and all, is it like the basis for all, or do you have the possibility of doing with other material as well?
No, it's a great question. So I mean, if you just look around in those areas, there's traditional build and traditional indigenous build, and whether that's, you know, bamboo, earth and building materials. There's a wonderful group that's created these housing infrastructure using essentially sandbags and earthen, you know, filled bags, earth bags, and interlaced with barbed wire. So you get the tensile strength and you get the compression on top of that tensile strength, and then they coat that with basically, you know, clay, plaster, you know, kind of adobe style, and it creates these very beautiful shapes, which are really pretty dense and thick walls, but you get this amazing coolness when it's hot outside inside those structures, and of course the same thing, they can be in the middle of a winter environment and you get very great, you know, heat retention. They're also seismic proof and pest resistant and mold resistant. So there's a lot of ways to create, you know, these kinds of villages and village infrastructure that is long lasting and is literally dirt cheap. You know, it's literally just using local earthen materials, and so we're really excited about what can be done, you know, in this regard.
Okay, final question. So you mentioned Resilient Frontiers. I know Yusuf is working on getting a lot of things done under the Resilient Frontiers initiative, but we also have other things like the national adaptation plans, where Paul is focusing on the countries working on adaptation plans. So then we have also climate migration, displacement that's happening, where all these risk elements come in. Can we, as when I say we, I'm talking about your initiative, could it be integrated as a proposal for adaptation under these processes, where you can potentially link the funding mechanisms to it as well? Have you taken any initiative to connect this?
Yeah, we'd be very happy to do that. And our goal, like I've said, is from the very beginning, when we came up with this research initiative at Stanford and then turned it into an impact for-profit company, is really, our goal has and continues to be this ability to transact with sovereign wealth, pension funds, and now this new era of green transition funds. In the aggregate, we're talking about literally trillions of euros and dollars. A lot of money also that transited, you know, fossil fuel investments. You know, these government funds that left, you know, early in 2019 and 2018 and even earlier from fossil fuel investments. They have a lot of money, and they're really they're looking for the right impact. Asset-backed land, you know, real estate that has some, you know, kind of securitization, but for the most part, that represents SDG impact. And of course, ReGen Villages answers almost all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you know, and the 8 pathways, you know, of the Resilience Lab and the Climate Change Secretariat. So we're very much excited and interested to participate with frameworks where we can be introduced, especially to the larger government, systemic players, and the larger industrial constructor development players, because they really have to be involved in because our feeling is that when you involve those industrial players, then, you know, the red tape and all these other kinds of things can be reduced. And we'll also need to reduce corruption and graft. These are also challenges that have to be overcome. That's the only way you're going to get to affordability and social housing, when you can create these communities that are in the benefit for the people who live there. So, and not just continuing to aggregate wealth back to small percentage of folks. So there's a lot of work we have to do in that, but I believe that wholeheartedly that a relationship between industry, standing up and saying, okay, we want to do this from a prefab assembly line scale kind of concept. Building and replicating these villages all across, let's say, rural India and other parts of Africa and the world. That there is a business model at the bottom of the pyramid. If you look at small percentages in the aggregate, right? So not being greedy, but doing it in the right way. And then the government says, oh, these industrial players are interested to do this in the right way. Then we can work with them to use this platform, change the rules, and make it happen in a way that essentially uses these green bonds. And these green bonds can then draw down, literally billions of euro and dollars from those sovereign wealth pension funds. So it's not a big amount of money when you're talking about trillions in play to take a few billion and be able to create hundreds or maybe thousands or tens of thousands of these self-sustaining neighborhoods rapidly around the world. And that's really exciting. I know we can do it. It is an assembly line approach to better future of living in these self-sustaining communities. So anything that the community here wants to support and help with, we're grateful for, because we believe that this is honestly the best and probably only way to address the existential threat facing us right now.
Okay, so thank you very much. We had Mr. James Ehrlich today with us. We are very grateful for waking up early in the morning and joining us. It's quite early where he is. And thank you everyone for joining us today and all the questions, a lively discussion. And bye from us and best of luck for your next session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you and bye.
Bye-bye.